In the end, she learned the ghost she lived with was no illusion, but a man named Elias whose story had been lost to time. When 5 strangers gave back his name, she gave him peace. And though his presence vanished, the silence that remained was no longer lonely. Where and what time are you watching this? The cabin stood on the edge of the timberline, where the forest grew silent in winter and the rivers froze under sheets of white silence. For 13 years, Evelyn Graves had lived there with nothing but the echo of her own breath, the creak of wood, and the sound that was not hers. Some nights when the fire went low, she swore she heard footsteps pacing the upper floor. Other nights, the rocking chair by the hearth shifted with a groan, though no hand touched it. She did not call it a haunting, not out loud, for naming such things gave them form. Instead, she called it the presence, and over the years, she had grown used to its company, used to the faint drafts that whispered her name when the wind did not blow, used to the mirror that sometimes showed another face behind hers. Her neighbors, those few who lived scattered across the valley, stopped coming after the 2nd year. They whispered that the Graves cabin was cursed, that the woman who lived there had either gone mad with grief or struck a bargain with something that should not be named. Evelyn never corrected them, let them believe what they wished. Solitude was a shield, and so was fear. The truth was harder. Her husband, Thomas, had died in that very cabin. He had gone into the woods during the great blizzard, hunting meat to keep them alive, and had never returned. Days later, she found his body half buried in the snow, his eyes wide open, as though frozen not just by death, but by something he had seen. She buried him beneath the tall pines, yet the cabin never emptied. His boots still stood by the door, though she had burned them years ago. His voice sometimes broke the silence. At first she thought it was memory, but memory did not whisper warnings before storms, and memory did not move objects when her back was turned. For 13 years, she had lived with that ghost. Not always cruel, not always kind. Sometimes protective, sometimes wrathful. She had grown used to it, though she never dared to name it, never dared to ask if it truly was her husband or something else that had worn his voice like a mask dot. It was on the 14th winter that they came, the 5 riders. She saw them before. She heard them, shadows moving through the snow fog at dawn, dark coats flapping like wings. Her hand went to the rifle before she even realized it, her body moving from habit. Strangers seldom rode into these woods. Strangers seldom left them either. The horses halted in the clearing, steam rising from their nostrils, eyes glinting. The men did not dismount right away. They studied her cabin as if it were not wood and nails but a shrine. Then, as though at some unseen signal, they climbed down, boots crunching snow, and one of them tall, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat spoke. "We've come for the ghost," he said. His voice was calm, too calm, as if the cold air carried no weight in his lungs. Evelyn's blood went still. Her finger tightened against the rifle's trigger. "There's nothing here for you," she said. Another man, older, with a scar across his cheek, shook his head. "There is. We know its name." The words hung between them like frost. Evelyn did not move. She had lived with the ghost for 13 years, had listened to it whisper, had endured its presence without ever daring to name it. Now 5 strangers stood before her, claiming they knew what she feared to ask. And for the first time in years, the rocking chair behind her creaked loud, deliberate, as if something inside the cabin was listening. The night stretched long and merciless, as if the sky itself had grown weary of offering light to the earth. Clara sat by the cabin's narrow window, her hands folded tight in her lap, though she did not realize she was gripping the hem of her skirt so hard her knuckles had gone pale. The candle before her flickered with an unsteady flame, its wax dripping steadily into the shallow dish, leaving behind hardened ridges that mapped the hours she had spent in waiting. In the fragile glow of the glass, she saw the shape again, not in the room, but lingering in the pane's reflection. a suggestion of someone standing just beyond where the light faded, their face half-formed, their presence undeniable. She turned her head sharply, but the cabin was empty save for her breath, and the whisper of the wind crawling under the doorframe. The ghost had been with her since the thaw of winter, when the river ice cracked and moaned like the sound of breaking bones. At first she thought it was loneliness. That isolation so deep and bitter that her own footsteps startled her was drawing her mind into invention. But the figure had grown more precise over the passing weeks. It leaned against the wall when she stoked the fire. It hovered by the rafters when she laid her head on the thin mattress. It appeared by the window at night, never pressing its face fully into view, but always near enough for her to sense its watching. She had given it no name, for she feared to speak to it. To name was to acknowledge, to open the door wider than it already stood. Yet it was not always threatening. Some nights it seemed to keep her company, as if the silence between them was a truce neither dared to break. But tonight, the silence seemed different. It was heavier, filled with the weight of expectation. She rose from the chair and pulled her shawl tighter across her shoulders. The boards beneath her feet groaned, brittle with years of weathering, and she thought she heard the faintest murmur echo with them, as if the wood remembered other voices. Her father used to tell her that land remembers, that the plains and rivers and hills keep what men forget. She thought of him often when she heard the creak of timbers or the sigh of wind through the cracks. Sometimes she wondered if what she saw was not a ghost of a man at all, but the ghost of memory itself, pressing close to her because she was all that remained of a time already vanished. The fire in the hearth coughed as if choked, and the flames dwindled to a faint glow. Shadows reached long and crooked across the floor, and the air thickened, until she felt as though she were wading through water. Clara forced her breath steady, gripping the iron poker as though it could fend off something beyond flesh and bone. She whispered then, against her will, "If you have a name, say it." The silence after was worse than noise, for in it she thought she heard the shape shifting in the dark, as though the room itself had leaned closer to listen. She clenched her eyes shut, waiting for sound, for words, for anything that would confirm her madness or relieve it, but nothing came. Only the scrape of wind against the cabin walls and the slow, deliberate thud of her heartbeat in her ears. Still, she could not shake the sense that something had heard her and was waiting for the right moment to answer. The night stretched long in that cabin, and though daylight often carried a thin comfort, darkness was its true inheritance. She had grown accustomed to the creaks of timber, to the sound of the wind bending through the gaps in the logs. But there was one sound that never settled into familiarity, the whisper that came not from lips, but from the hollow between walls and memory. It was neither fully male nor female, neither warm nor cold. It was a ghost's murmur, one that pressed closer as the lantern's flame bent low. She never dared to answer it aloud, fearing what acknowledgement might awaken, but in her mind, she had begun to form words for it, words that trembled on the edge of prayer and rebellion. The ghost was not cruel, nor was it kind. It existed as if memory itself had learned to breathe. At times, it carried the smell of river water, though the nearest stream had dried years before. Other nights, it brought the faint scrape of boots upon wood, as if the cabin remembered the men who once entered and never left. Once, she swore. She felt a hand brush her shoulder, light as dust, leaving her frozen between the instinct to run and the knowledge that there was nowhere left to run to. It was on the third night after the strangers had departed that she found the ghost bolder than before. She sat at the table, her lantern burning low, the rifle resting by her knee. The air shifted. She could feel it, the way the unseen bends itself around breath. A chair scraped softly, though no hand had pulled it. Across from her, the empty space shimmered faintly, as though heat rose from cold wood. She closed her eyes, certain she would lose her mind, and when she opened them, the shimmer remained. She wanted to scream. Instead, she whispered, "What do you want from me?" The silence that followed was not empty, it was heavy. The cabin seemed to draw in its breath. Then, in a voice thinner than wind, the ghost spoke. "Not you, them." She stood abruptly, knocking her chair backward. The lantern rattled on the table, flame stretching high before steadying. She grabbed her rifle and pressed her back to the wall, eyes darting. Her heart slammed hard against her ribs. Them, she knew. Instantly who the ghost meant, the strangers. The 5 who had claimed to know its name. Her sleep that night was broken, not by dreams but by the heavy weight of watchfulness. The ghost no longer lingered quietly in corners. It moved with intent, shifting boards, rattling the pan on the stove, brushing the edges of her hair when she tried to rest. And every time she stirred, it seemed closer. By dawn, her eyes were ringed with shadow, her body trembling not from cold, but from the haunting certainty that she was no longer alone in her own skin. The next evening, when the orange light bled across the horizon, she found herself pacing the length of the cabin floor. The strangers' faces burned in her memory, their words, their cryptic certainty. They had called the ghost by a name she had never known, and the ghost had answered them. It had grown louder since they arrived, more restless, as if their presence had stirred something bound deep in the wood of the walls. She wanted to hate them for it, wanted to drive them off the way she had driven coyotes from the yard. But part of her knew it was too late. They had woken something that had been waiting all these years. On the 4th night, the ghost's voice came again, clearer now, the whisper almost human. "They will return." And in that moment, she did not doubt it. The cabin had never felt this full of silence. Not even when the ghost whispered through the boards at midnight. Not even when she woke with the sound of footsteps she knew weren't her own. Tonight, the air pressed so heavy it almost hummed. The 5 strangers who had appeared at dusk were now seated at her rough-hewn table, their eyes darting at the corners of the cabin, as though they too felt the presence she had long accepted as part of her life. The lantern flame wavered between them, making the shadows dance and stretch across the walls. And in those shadows she thought she saw it. No, him leaning just beyond the reach of the light. The ghost. Silent, watchful, like he had always. Then one of the men, the oldest, with a face carved by sun and grief, leaned forward and set his calloused hands on the table. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. "You've been living with him all these years, haven't you?" He didn't phrase it as a question, more like an accusation. She swallowed, her throat dry. "I don't know what you mean," she lied. But it was useless. She could feel the ghost lingering closer now, as though the stranger's words had drawn him near. Got another of the men. Younger, restless, his hand twitching near his holster, though there was no threat but the unseen, said, "We know his name. That's why we came." She froze. The cabin seemed to tilt. For years she had lived with this spirit, feeling his weight in the rafters, his cold breath at her back, but never, not once, had she heard a name. The silence that followed was thick, so much so she almost begged them to speak, but pride held her tongue. The 3rd man, the one with eyes that looked like storm clouds about to break, whispered it. A name, brittle and sharp, cutting through the night like a blade. And when it passed his lips, the lantern shuddered, flared, then nearly went out. The ghost stirred. She felt him, heavy and sudden, close enough that the hairs on her arm rose. The strangers shifted uneasily, but none looked surprised. They had known this would happen. Her pulse quickened, fear and something else mingling, hope, maybe. After all these years, could the mystery finally break open? She turned her gaze toward the dark corner where the figure had always lingered. And this time she didn't look away. The air thickened. The strangers leaned forward. The ghost began to move. And for the first time, she wondered if knowing his name was not a gift, but a curse. The air inside the cabin had shifted from uneasy to suffocating, as if the weight of memory itself had taken root in the timber beams and the ragged curtains fluttering at the window. The 5 strangers sat scattered, each posture betraying some piece of truth they refused to voice aloud. The woman's hands were steady, but her chest carried the ache of years alone. Years spent with nothing but the creak of floorboards and the whisper of something unseen, something that these men now dared to name. The one with the scar across. His cheek leaned forward, his voice gravelly as if drawn from another life. "We didn't come here to take. We came here because we heard him. Heard the one you've been living with." His words scraped the silence raw, and the lantern's flame wavered as though touched by a sudden breath. The woman tightened her grip on the rifle by her side, but she did not raise it. Instead, she studied their faces, searching for deceit, for hunger, for the familiar glint of men who wandered into the wilderness only to plunder what they found. Yet none of them looked at her. They looked past her, toward the darker corner of the cabin where the rocking chair stood unmoved. As though waiting for its occupant, her heart rattled against her ribs. She had never spoken of the ghost, not aloud. Yet these men not only knew. Of it they spoke of him, as if he had walked among them once. The tall one, his hat shadowing eyes filled with something like reverence, finally whispered. His name was Elias. The name struck her like a storm in the valley, scattering the careful stillness she had built over the years. She staggered back, her hand brushing the wooden edge of the table. She wanted to deny it, to shout them down, but the cabin itself betrayed her. A low groan carried through the beams, the rocking chair shifted once, and the lantern dimmed, then flared. The men straightened but did not flinch. One of them, his hair silvered with age, closed his eyes and whispered something she couldn't quite catch. A prayer or a memory. Her chest tightened as fragments of her past flickered like distant lightning. Elias. She had not spoken the name since the river froze the winter after he was taken from her. And now, 5 men sat in her cabin, speaking it with the familiarity of those who had not only known him, but followed him. She demanded answers, her voice raw and hoarse. "You say his name like you knew him. Tell me why you're here." Their silence was its own confession, broken only when the scarred man finally admitted, "Because he called us here." And with that, the room seemed to tilt, shadows deepening, the fire guttering low, and a voice so faint it could have been the creak of wood or the sigh of the wind stirred in the rafters above. The cabin walls breathed with her, as though the logs themselves remembered the presence of the ghost that lingered within. That night, when the wind howled against the mountainside and the fire hissed low, she sat in her chair clutching the old ledger she had found in the rafters. Its pages whispered of debts unpaid, names marked in faded ink, and a single one scrawled so many times it seemed to pulse with meaning. Elias, the name that the strangers had spoken as if it belonged to them, as if the ghost itself was theirs to summon. She ran her fingers over the ink, and the shadows along the wall thickened, swelling into the shape of a man's outline. His head tilted toward her, though no face could be seen, only the hollow impression of eyes. She whispered his name, uncertain. If it was a mistake, and the cabin shuddered as though the earth itself exhaled. Outside, the 5 men built a small fire, their voices carrying low and deliberate across the distance. She could not make out their words, but she felt them pressing into her chest like the weight of an unseen hand. The horses pawed nervously at the ground, their breath steaming in the cold, and every so often one would turn sharply, ears pinned, toward the cabin as though it could see what no human eye dared look upon. She thought of extinguishing her fire, thought of sitting in darkness and waiting for dawn, but the ghost would not let her. His presence filled the room, pressing against her ribs, urging her to listen. When the wind shifted, she heard a fragment of their conversation. Blood debt, unfinished. Her. That was enough to make her rise. She set the ledger on the table, its pages fluttering open of their own accord, as if invisible fingers flipped them. The candle flame bent backward, stretching unnaturally, and a single word formed in smoke. On the air. Stay. Her breath caught in her throat, because she did not know whether it was a warning or a command. The ghost's presence grew stronger as midnight drew near. The creak of boots sounded on her porch, though she had not seen any man rise from the fire. She held her rifle tight, but the door never opened. Instead, the latch trembled as though an unseen hand tested it, patient, unhurried. Her skin crawled. She backed away until her shoulders pressed to the cold log wall, the rifle barrel rising. Then silence. Utter silence, broken only by the sound of her own heartbeat. And then she heard it, a voice, low, gravelly, and unmistakably male, yet coming from inside the cabin, not outside, not across the room, right behind her ear. "Do you know my name?" She froze, breath hitching, and the shadows surged against the wall like a tide. The ghost had spoken. And with that sound, the strangers outside rose to their feet as if they had been waiting for that exact moment. She could hear their spurs jingling. In the dirt, their boots crunching the frost, all moving toward the cabin. The night had grown darker than most she remembered, though the moon's pale light cut through the silence like the edge of a knife. The forest no longer hummed with the usual night songs of crickets or owls. It was still, as though the trees themselves were listening. She stood by the cabin door, her lantern shaking faintly in her hand, casting golden light on the rough-hewn timbers. Behind her, she could feel the presence again like a shadow pressed into her skin, heavy but unseen. Only tonight, it seemed closer, stronger, almost desperate. And when she glanced back into the doorway, she swore she saw him, just a blur, of a man's outline, tall, shoulders heavy, his face indistinct. The strangers had not left, not since they had spoken his name. That impossible name, the one she herself had never known yet carried in her dreams for years. They lingered in the clearing like a judgment waiting to be passed, their horses restless, hooves striking the dry ground in anxious beats. The man at the front, the one with a scar dragging down his cheek like a crooked river, watched her not with suspicion, but with patience, like he already knew she would speak to them. She hated the way he looked at her, as though her fate had already been written and he was merely waiting for her to accept it. She whispered under her breath, as though to the ghost, "Why are they here? What do they know?" The air shifted inside the cabin, cold enough to make her breath visible. She shivered, tightening her shawl, though the voice low, like the sound of wind moving across stones, gave no clear answer. Just a murmur, a presence pressing into her thoughts. The silence between the living and the dead was heavy, suffocating. Stepping forward, she called to the riders. "You said you knew him, that ghost, that name. What do you want of me?" The scarred man dismounted, his boots crunching against the earth, each step deliberate. "We don't want anything of you," he said, his voice rough but steady. "It's him we've come for. The man who lingers in your walls, the one bound to this ground like a dog to a chain. He's not yours. He never was." The words sliced through her. Not hers. For years she had lived with that haunting, the breath of a ghost in her ears, the sound of footsteps on her floor when she was alone, the whispers that came in dreams. He had been her curse, her companion, her mystery. To hear a stranger tell her he belonged to something else, it felt like a theft. "He is mine," she said, firmer than she expected. "If only because he's all I've had." Something flickered. In the stranger's expression, regret, perhaps. "Then you've been lied to," he said back behind him. The others stirred. One muttered about the danger of staying too long. Another spat into the dirt, as though the place itself was foul. They all looked uneasy, but not at her, at the cabin. At the weight pressing from the shadows, she glanced back again, and this time the ghost's presence wasn't faint. He stood clearer than ever within the doorway. Not fully flesh, not fully smoke, but his outline sharp against the lamplight. Broad shoulders, hands at his sides, eyes like hollow darks were stars. Should have been. And though no breath came from him, She could feel his fury coil through the air like heat off a fire. "They shouldn't be here," she whispered. "They're making you angry." For the first time in all those years, she heard it words, shaped from silence, not only inside her head but in the open night, like the scraping of stone against stone. "They know too much." Her heart slammed in her chest. "What is it they know?" she asked. The scarred man answered for him. That he was not just a man once, he was something worse. And he should never have been allowed to linger. Her lantern trembled, casting wild shadows. The ghost stepped forward, his form growing sharper, denser, his fury like a storm breaking in the air. She stumbled back, her shoulder hitting the rough wood of the cabin. Her eyes darted between the strangers and the spirit, one flesh and bone, the other smoke and rage, and for the first time, she wondered if she had ever truly known the thing she had lived with all these years. "You don't understand," she whispered. He's not evil." The scarred man's voice was like iron. "No? Then why does he hide his name? Why does he bind himself to you like a chain around your neck? We came to speak it aloud, to set him free, or to send him where he belongs." The ghost's form twisted, the air howling through the clearing, though no wind stirred the trees. The horses reared, restless, eyes white in the moonlight. The strangers drew weapons, not only guns but charms, bits of bone strung on leather, strange symbols carved into wood. Things older than the frontier, older than gunpowder. And for the first time she saw the ghost recoil, her breath caught. Whatever he was, whoever he had been, he feared them, but fear turned quickly to rage. The ground itself seemed to hum, a vibration running through the dirt beneath her feet. She clutched the doorway for balance, staring in horror as the ghost surged forward, no longer the vague shadow of a man but a figure burning with something unnatural, a shape that bent the moonlight and made the air tremble. His voice thundered without sound, echoing in her bones, shaking the cabin walls. The scarred man lifted a hand, his companions forming a line, chanting words that made no sense to her, words that seemed to cut the air like knives. The ghost roared soundless, but deafening, and she realized with a shiver of dread that she was caught between the two, the thing she had lived with all her life, and the men who had come to banish it. She did not know who to trust. Her hand closed over the locket she always wore, the one she had found in the cabin when she first came here, the one with no picture inside, just the faint scent of smoke that never faded. She had thought it was a keepsake of the ghost's past, a clue to who once was. Now as it burned cold against her palm, she wondered if it was something else entirely, a key, a tether, maybe even the chain that bound him to her. In 4. The first time, she asked herself the question she had never dared. Had she kept him all these years, or had he kept her? The chanting grew louder, the ghost surged closer. The strangers raised their charms, and the night so quiet before erupted into a storm of fury and light. The air inside the cabin seemed to thicken as the ghost's name was spoken again, softly, like a thread pulled through cloth. The strangers had not dared repeat it loudly, and yet even whispered, it vibrated in the beams and floorboards, trembling in the marrow of the house. She stood stiffly, her lantern trembling in her grasp, the golden light swaying in nervous arcs across the warped wood and cracked glass. The men sat hunched in the corners, their faces hollowed by shadow and silence, as if speaking had emptied them of something vital. No one moved, no one breathed too deeply. Even the wind had stopped pressing at the shutters, as if it too were listening for what came next. When the silence broke, it was not from outside. The sound rose from the cracks beneath her feet, the thrum of something heavy dragging in the dark earth, circling, climbing, swelling. Her chest tightened. The lantern shook so hard it nearly slipped from her grip, and the flame guttered dangerously low before catching again. The ghost had always been presence more than form, a cold draft, a soft murmur in the rafters, a sigh from the stove when it hadn't been lit. But now, With its name uttered, it was no longer hiding. It was awake. You should not have said it, she whispered, her voice unsteady, though it seemed impossible to speak above a hush. One of the strangers, the one with pale hair and a scar splitting his cheek, looked at her with a weariness that seemed centuries older than his face. It already knew we were here. Saying its name only makes it honest. His words were steady, but his hands betrayed him, fidgeting at the hem of his coat as if trying to tether himself to something tangible. The floor groaned as if something pressed down from beneath, slow and deliberate, the kind of sound that turned the bones cold. She stepped back toward the center of the room, the lantern casting her shadow long against the wall where it twisted unnaturally, a shape too tall, too wide, stretching beyond her frame. The strangers watched with the intensity of men staring into a noose. "Do you see it now?" one of them asked. She opened her mouth to deny it, but the words died as the air shifted. A figure began to ripple in the corner near the stove, born of smoke and silence. It had no face, not fully, only the suggestion of one, pressed faintly into the dark, as though it were forever in the process of being remembered. Her lantern flickered, the glass rattling as if from the pull of unseen breath. The figure turned, or at least it seemed to. And for the first time since she had lived in the cabin, she thought she saw eyes staring back. Her chest tightened until she thought it might split, but she did not drop the lantern. Instead, she held it high, illuminating the figure's half-formed mouth. The strangers stirred uneasily, some crossing themselves, some gripping the edges of their seats, as if the wood could shield them from the truth crawling up from beneath their own skin. "Say it," the pale-haired man whispered to her. His voice was not a command, but a plea. "Say the name." Her throat closed. She had never dared, not once in the years she had lived with its whispers, its sighs, its restless pacing. But the cabin trembled as though the walls themselves longed for it. The figure in the corner leaned closer, the space around her thickening like smoke, pressing against her lungs. She parted her lips, but no sound came. Instead, the ghost spoke first. And when it did, the sound was not a word, it was her own name. The fire was almost gone. Only the faintest glow of embers remained, pulsing like a weak heartbeat beneath the ash. Around it, the 5 strangers sat in silence, their shoulders slumped and their faces caught in the pale wash of moonlight. The desert was endless in every direction, silvered by the night, and the cabin stood not far away, its crooked frame barely upright, its single window lit with a faint glow that seemed too fragile, too hesitant to belong to any living flame. Inside that cabin, she sat with her back to the wall. Her hands were pressed to her knees, her breath shallow. The ghost had not appeared fully since the moment the strangers had spoken its name aloud. It lingered instead as a shape in her periphery, a weight in the air, as though it had wrapped itself around the walls and was watching all from the silence between heartbeats. Her mind kept turning back to their words. They had claimed to know the ghost's name. Not just a name, but the true one, the name it had once carried when it still had flesh, when its heart had beaten and its voice had spoken words that belonged to the living. A name that, if spoken, could either bind it or release it. But they had not told her yet. Instead, they had said, "We will show you in time, when the night is ready." And so she waited. Outside, the strangers shifted around the dead fire. One of them tall, gaunt, with eyes that seemed too sharp to belong to an ordinary man, stood and looked toward the cabin. The others followed his gaze, their movements slow, deliberate, as though every gesture was calculated, rehearsed. She felt the weight of their stares pressing through the wood, pressing into her. The ghost stirred then. It moved like smoke along the wall, coiling toward the door. Her breath caught as the faint outline of a man, broad shoulders, a head bowed, formed in the gloom. Its presence filled the air with a cold so sharp it burned. Her skin prickled. her teeth clenched against a tremor that wanted to shake her bones apart. The ghost turned its head toward the door, toward the strangers outside, and though its face was no more than shadow, she felt its attention, its recognition, like a blade grazing her throat. It knew them. It remembered. A sound came from the camp outside, a low hum, almost like a chant. The 5 men were murmuring together, their voices rising and falling in a rhythm that did not belong to any prayer she knew. The cadence was older, heavier, like a song pulled from the earth itself. She rose unsteadily, her palms pressed against the rough boards of the cabin wall. The ghost moved closer. Its figure shifted and grew sharper in outline, as though the chanting had summoned it into being. She could almost see its face now, hollow cheeks, a mouth frozen halfway open, eyes that shimmered like water reflecting starlight. She thought. She saw sorrow there. Or maybe rage. The chanting stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Then came footsteps. The strangers were approaching the cabin. The boards groaned as they neared the porch, their boots grinding against the dirt. She pressed herself against the wall, torn between the urge to run and the knowledge that there was nowhere to go. The first knock came like a gunshot. The sound rang through the cabin, echoing in her skull. The ghost recoiled, its figure dissolving, like smoke caught in the wind. She felt its retreat into the darker corners, but not gone at all. The second knock followed, slower, deliberate. Her throat was dry. Her lips cracked as she whispered, "What do you want?" No answer, only the scrape of boots shifting on the porch. Then, at last, a voice low, rasping, a sound that seemed to come from a chest too hollow to hold breath. "We want to finish what began here. We want to tell you the truth of the ghost." Her body tensed, every muscle drawn tight as a bowstring. She stepped toward the door, her bare feet silent against the boards. The glow in the window flickered behind her, casting her shadow tall and warped. Her hand hovered over the latch but did not touch it. The ghost moved again. It appeared behind her, close enough that she could feel its presence pressing at her back. Its face leaned near her ear, though no sound came from its mouth. Still, she felt it, the urgency, the warning, the plea. She closed her eyes, trembling, trying to understand. "Say the name," one of the strangers outside commanded. "You have carried it long enough without knowing. Tonight it must be spoken." Her breath quickened. She turned her head slightly, as though the ghost could answer her. But it only stared with hollow eyes, its expression unreadable. The latch of the door rattled. One of them was trying it. She stumbled back, her hand flying to the small table by the wall where an old rifle leaned. The wood was splintered, the barrel rusted, but it was something solid, something living in her hands. She pointed it toward the door, her heart hammering in her throat. "You come in here," she said, her voice shaking, "and I'll put lead in you." The silence that followed was worse than any reply. The strangers stood unmoving on the porch. She could feel their patience, their certainty. They were not afraid of her, nor of the rifle, nor of anything that might have been waiting inside. With her, they knew something she didn't. The ghost moved again, drifting toward the window. It pressed one hand against the glass, its shadowy palm leaving no mark, but radiating a terrible cold. It was looking outward, toward them, as if waiting at last. The gaunt man's voice spoke again. "His name is not for you to fear. It is for you to release." The word release sank into her like a stone into water. Release the ghost? Let it go? Or free it to become something worse? Her grip tightened on the rifle. Her voice cracked as she demanded, "Then say it. Say the name." But they didn't. Instead, they stepped back into the moonlight, their faces revealed. For the first time, she saw them clearly, eyes hollow yet burning, expressions carved from sorrow and memory. And in their eyes, she saw the ghost's reflection. It knew them. And they knew it. The night stretched taut between them all, as if the very desert held its breath. And then, without warning, the ghost turned its face. Fully formed now, its lips moving soundlessly, trying to speak. Its mouth opened wide, but the name caught like ash in its throat. She reached forward instinctively, desperate to hear, to understand. But the moment shattered. The strangers began to chant again, louder this time, their voices rising into a furious storm. The ghost staggered, its form trembling violently, as though being torn apart by invisible hands. She fell to her knees, the rifle clattering from her grip as the cabin shook around her. The air itself seemed to break, and the name just a fragment, a syllable slipped into her mind. Enough to make her gasp, enough to make the ghost's eyes lock with hers in a moment of unbearable recognition. The truth was coming, but she was not sure she would survive it. The evening had a heaviness about it, as if the land itself knew that something long buried had clawed its way into the open. The 5 strangers stood near the cabin, their shadows twisted by the sinking sun, and Eleanor felt the weight of their words pressing on her chest. They had named the ghost. They had given breath to the silence that had lived in her cabin all these years. She had thought the voice in the walls belonged only to her imagination, born of loneliness and grief, but now it stood beside her, clear, undeniable, and real. The faint shape of the man she had spoken with in whispers and half-dreams flickered. In the orange light, his face lined with a sorrow she recognized all too well. The strangers removed their hats, their expressions worn, not hostile but reverent, as though they had come not to harm, but to deliver something sacred. "We called him Elias," the eldest of them said, voice trembling. And at the sound of the name, the ghost's form shimmered as though strengthened by its remembrance. Eleanor's breath caught, because the name carried a truth that resonated. Deep inside her, Elias, that was the name she had once scribbled in the margins of her journal, long before the voice had grown clear, long before she believed the cabin itself had memory. The eldest rider stepped forward, placing a weathered satchel at Eleanor's feet. "This belonged to him. We have carried it for many years, waiting for the time we would meet the one who kept him alive." Eleanor bent down, her hands shaking as she opened the satchel. Inside were letters, scraps of journals, and a lock of hair tied in faded ribbon. The handwriting was unmistakable, the same she had seen on the etchings carved into the beams of her cabin when she first moved in. The ghost turned toward her then, more solid than ever before. His eyes, though pale and unearthly, were filled with gratitude. For years he had been nameless, a shadow, a whisper. And now, because of these 5 strangers, his story was returned to him. Eleanor felt tears burn her cheeks, and she whispered the name aloud, steady and reverent. "Elias." At the sound, the ghost seemed to lift his head higher, as though freed from chains unseen. The 5 strangers told their story in fragments. Around the fire they lit outside the cabin as night crept in. Elias had been one of them once, a rider, who wandered too far from the safety of the trail. He had died on this land alone, but his spirit had never left. The cabin had been built near his resting place, and when Eleanor moved in, her grief had drawn him, for grief called to grief. In her solitude, she had unknowingly given him voice, keeping him tethered to the world he could not leave behind. But tonight was different. The air trembled as if alive, and Eleanor knew the ghost's time was nearly done. Elias stepped toward the firelight, his outline sharp against the dark. He looked at Eleanor with something that resembled peace. "You gave me a name again," his voice whispered, stronger than it had ever been. "And now I can rest." Eleanor's heart ached at the thought of losing him, the presence that had kept her from being truly alone in the wilderness. But she understood. Love, even the strange kind that existed between the living and the dead, was not about possession. It was about release. She nodded slowly, her lips trembling. "Then go, Elias, rest." The ghost smiled, faint and fleeting, before dissolving into the night air like smoke carried on the wind. The fire flickered, and suddenly he was gone. The silence left behind was heavy, but it was not empty. It was whole, filled with the echo of his name. The 5 strangers lingered until dawn, then mounted their horses and rode away, leaving Eleanor with the satchel of memories and the cabin that no longer whispered. She stood on the porch, watching. The horizon glow gold with morning light. Though her cabin was quiet now, it did not feel haunted. It felt alive, because the ghost she had lived with had finally found peace, and in his release, so had she.